Welcome back. This is part 2 of the introduction to training modules on enterprise risk management. Part 1, which I hope you've already checked in with, introduces you to risk management and ERM in particular, and why and how government agencies are adopting risk management as an essential part of decision making. This will be part 2. It provides an overview of ERM and good agency practices. Both parts let you benchmark your agency against good management practice. Let's get started with part 2. I'm Tom Stanton, President of the Association for Federal Enterprise Risk Management, or AFIRM. I teach as an adjunct at Johns Hopkins University and have done so for many years. Was a senior executive in the federal government for about 5 years, and have had a long career working with government agencies to improve the way public services are delivered. Among other clients that I've served over the years are the Government Accountability Office, Congressional Budget Office, Office of Management and Budget, Financial Management Service of the Treasury Department, and a variety of federal agencies, and especially those that provide loans or loan guarantees. Today, it's my pleasure to talk with you about part 2 of managing risk of government agencies and programs, and enterprise risk management in particular. Let's start once again with the definition, and we had this in part 1, of enterprise risk management. The Association for Federal Enterprise Risk Management has developed a definition as follows. ERM is a discipline that addresses the full spectrum of an organization's risks, including challenges and opportunities, and integrates them into an enterprise-wide, strategically aligned portfolio view. And there are a few points to note here. First of all, we are talking about major risks. And the way I would like to phrase it is, what are the risks that could prevent my agency from achieving its mission or objectives? Secondly, we're taking an enterprise-wide view across the organization. In other words, it doesn't pay, if we're worried about risk management, to spend scarce resources trying to patch small risks if we leave large risks unaddressed. So you've got to take a portfolio view and deal with the most important risks first. The third point is that we're talking about challenges and opportunities. In other words, as we noted at the end of part 1, why does a car have brakes? A car has brakes so it can go fast. Without brakes, we'd simply creep around. With brakes, we feel confident going forward, and the same is true of a federal agency. The risks we have to worry about most are the ones we don't suspect. Once we understand and we have a good mental map of the kind of risks our agency might face, their seriousness, their likelihood, then we can begin to go forward and develop our mission, unfold our mission with a pretty good sense of how we've got to deal with the risks on the way. A leading expert on enterprise risk management is John Fraser, formerly the Chief Risk Officer and also Chief Financial Officer of Hydro One, a power company in Canada owned by the province of Ontario. John and his colleagues have written and edited a variety of articles and books, and at the end we will refer to some of those for further reading if you wish. And John has a really good way to try to picture the processes that lead to good enterprise risk management. He divides ERM into 2 parts. First, conversations, and second, prioritization. What does he mean by this? Basically, once again, John believes that information flow is essential for making good decisions. Too often, people at the top of an organization simply don't know important elements and vulnerabilities that exist in the middle or bottom of the organization. So John uses interviews and workshops to facilitate the flow of information about vulnerabilities, and information begins to flow up the hierarchy, by the way, up and down, and across the organization, across the different business units, what we call the silos of the organization. And this allows for a comprehensive identification of major risks across the silos. Once you have a good idea of the major risks that exist in the organization, then you can prioritize risks according to their likelihood, according to their potential severity, and begin to allocate resources accordingly. This is a function usually of senior managers, very often chaired by the chief operating officer, ultimately the chief executive officer or agency head, because in the end, those are the people at the very top of the organization that have to make intelligent decisions. How do we allocate our scarce resources in order to enhance performance of our agency, including dealing with vulnerabilities? And one important issue to keep in mind, and the reason why an enterprise-wide view is needed, is that risks in one part of the organization can affect the ability of other areas to achieve their objectives. In other words, we can't simply shut down a piece of our IT program, say we have budget cuts or whatever, without trying to think of the other parts of the organization that may depend on that IT function for their own performance. That's why the conversations are so important, both up and down the hierarchy and across the silos. So in the end, when you get to the prioritization process, you can understand from the point of view of the enterprise, the entire organization, the risks you've got to address and how you plan to address them. As the financial crisis broke, the Treasury Department created a new Office of Financial Stability. Its mission was to allocate hundreds of billions of dollars to large and actually smaller financial institutions in order to reassure the financial system that these institutions would not go out of business the way Lehman Brothers and other institutions had threatened to do during the financial crisis. The new head of the Office of Financial Stability was Neel Kashkari, who came from Goldman Sachs, a firm that had a very good and very strong financial risk management program. Mr. Kashkari came in and immediately assumed, as a course of business, since that's the environment he had come from, that his new government agency would have a serious enterprise risk management program. And what the Office of Financial Stability did was establish a program that was both top-down and then, in the way that information would percolate, bottom-up. So once again, if you look at these 8 items, you see the elements we have talked about with respect to enterprise risk management. The focus was on high priority areas of the organization, key processes, life cycle steps within each of those high priority areas, the development of risk interview questions so that one could elicit information from people throughout the organization, interviews with key stakeholders in each area, analysis of the risk, And then once you have the risks arrayed, you want to assign risk ratings, high, medium, or low, based once again on what is the likelihood of this risk occurring and what kind of problems will we have, what's the magnitude of damage that this risk could cause if it materializes. And then development of mitigation plans for areas that are high or medium in risk. And once again, periodic reports on the results of risk assessment. You've always got to, as a good manager, get reports on, how well are we implementing what we said we would carry out. And once again, this is a cycle. Once again, one would repeat the process systematically over time in order to ensure that new risks haven't developed, that major outstanding risks have been addressed, and so forth. Another way to look at attributes of enterprise risk management comes from RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society. And they have 7 points that are worth considering. First of all, ERM encompasses all different kinds of risk. In part 1, we talked about an array of risks that federal agencies face, ranging from cybersecurity to physical security to financial risk to reputational risk and so forth. Second, ERM prioritizes and manages these exposures across the entire enterprise rather than within each individual silo. And this is really important. We already used the example of an IT shop that if we have a budget cutback and we reduce the functions of that IT shop, we could create risks for all sorts of other parts of the organization. So you can't just look at an individual silo. The same thing happened in a more serious way, potentially more serious way, at the Internal Revenue Service when the Exempt Organizations Branch was alleged to have engaged in political favoritism, and the resulting political fallout of those allegations, regardless of whether they were ultimately shown to be true or not, the fallout affected the entire IRS regardless of where you were in the organization. So you've got to look at the enterprise level rather than in individual silos. And then you evaluate that risk portfolio in terms of all significant internal, external environments, systems, circumstances, and stakeholders. And then number 4, you recognize that individual risks across the organization are interrelated, and you can end up with a combined set of risks that are quite different from the individual risks seen alone. So again, to take the IRS example, if the Exempt Organizations Branch was looking at one organization, there may have been a risk that they miscategorized that organization and its eligibility for tax exemption, but it was the combination of risks that rolled up to a higher level in the organization that somebody had to be thinking about. Fifth, ERM provides a structured process for managing all risks, whether these are quantitative or qualitative in nature. And remember, some risks can't be modeled. If you're practicing enterprise risk management, it doesn't mean you're going out and buying a piece of software. Your quantitative analysis can fortify your assessment of risks, but it doesn't substitute for careful thought about those risks that may not be subject to quantification. 6, enterprise risk management can be a competitive advantage. In other words, in the private marketplace, the firms that thrived were able to use effective enterprise risk management to shed their exposure to risky assets before rather than after the financial crisis, when those assets essentially blew up on organizations' balance sheets and caused cascading problems across the financial system. The firms that thrived had detected those issues early and came out with a strong competitive advantage over the others. And finally, risk management should be embedded as a component in critical decisions throughout the organization. We'll talk about it, but in the end, one needs to have a culture of risk awareness so that it isn't just the function of a risk office. Rather, risk management is the job of every manager and the job of everybody in the organization to surface risks when they see them, and then for those in a risk facilitating function to ensure that those warning signals are followed up and evaluated. Applying enterprise risk management in the federal government requires thinking about a number of organizational issues. First, and possibly most important, enterprise risk management depends on having a collaborative senior management team. In other words, the agency head has to weld the senior management team together so that each of the individual, call them barons, right, the heads of each of the important business units, have to think about risks to the whole organization and not just about their own part of the organization for which they're directly responsible. That means that enterprise risk management very likely cannot be effective at the departmental level of the federal government. That's because so many departments have sub-agencies that are essentially independent from one another. So in the Treasury Department, for example, the Internal Revenue Service took a serious hit when risks materialized. But this simply didn't translate over to other bureaus like the Controller of the Currency or the Fiscal Service or other parts of the Treasury Department. The Department of Homeland Security was made up of 22 disparate federal agencies. And again, problems that occur in one part of the Department of Homeland Security may well not translate to other parts of the department, which means that the departmental level can encourage enterprise risk management in the constituent agencies, but probably not have enterprise risk management at the departmental level. So the agency is often the optimal level for enterprise risk management. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, the risks that affect one part of an agency may cut across the silos and affect others in the agency. So there's a lot more of a common interest. Secondly, it's a lot easier for an agency head to weld a management team together that thinks of themselves in terms of the whole organization than it is to weld a management team across a large department. On the other hand, many departments have chief risk officers, and these chief risk officers can play very important roles. They can monitor, encourage, and support enterprise risk management at each of their constituent agencies. So they can provide templates, they can share best practices, they can provide maturity models so that each agency can figure out where it is as it rolls out its ERM program along the spectrum from having a nascent program to having one that is fairly developed. And so the departmental CRO can provide important functions, but not actually engage in enterprise risk management at the departmental level. At the departmental level, selective risk management may be important. So a departmental risk officer or departmental assistant or undersecretary for management can pick a particularly important issue. These days, cyber would be one of those kinds of risk that would seem to cut across an entire department and can begin to impose standards and requirements to ensure protection against that particular kind of risk. This happened at the Department of Homeland Security with Undersecretary for Management Rafael Borras, who decided that a major risk for DHS was acquisition risk. In the largest procurements, very often the systems would come over budget, not on time, and some of them wouldn't even work. Or worse, you would have a multi-year procurement and suddenly funding would be cut off in the middle and the department would be left with nothing to show for its investment. So Mr. Borras established a systematic review policy, an investment committee that would review all large acquisitions, $300 million and over. And each of the constituent agencies would have to answer certain questions and provide certain information that then would be analyzed by a program assessment and risk management office that Mr. Borras established to scrub those proposals and ensure that it was appropriate for them to go forward, or in a number of cases to figure out ways that they could go forward in an improved manner. So you might have modules in an acquisition so that if Congress were to cut off funding in the midst of a multi-year procurement, the department would at least be sure that it would end up with something useful for the limited investment that it had been allowed to make. But again, this selective risk management is different from trying to practice enterprise risk management at the departmental level. So now it's time to consider your department or agency or other governmental organization. And here are 3 questions in descending order as we drill down that will allow you to assess whether enterprise risk management is possible or useful at your agency. First of all, do your senior managers work together as a team? Or alternatively, do they manage their separate units without sharing much information with each other, with other unit heads? Second, do your senior managers have a way to identify major risks and work together to address them before the risks materialize? Everybody works together for crisis management. We're talking about risk management, trying to manage issues before they blow up in an agency. Third, and here's the real test, are your senior managers willing to share resources to address major risks that could affect your department or agency, even if that spending is done for somebody else's silo, not their own line of responsibility? Are they willing to allocate resources in order to protect the agency from major risks materializing, or will they resist and try to hold on tightly to resources just for their own part of the organization? And that's a core test about whether your organization is ready for enterprise risk management, or whether, I call them the powerful barons in the organization, are so entrenched, maybe you have a weaker agency head than you need to bring them together, that enterprise risk management simply won't work at that level. It's an important diagnostic to begin so you figure out in advance the way you want to approach risk management in your department or agency. More and more agencies are beginning to adopt enterprise risk management. We've already talked about the Office of Financial Stability at the Treasury Department. Other agencies that have worked hard on enterprise risk management include the Office of Federal Student Aid at the Department of Education, the Federal Thrift Retirement Investment Board that manages the Thrift Savings Plan, and other agencies that are rolling out enterprise risk management. Also, if the federal agency level is not conducive to ERM, consider going to one lower level So if you're in the Department of Defense and your particular agency may not be ready for ERM, maybe a base, if you're a base commander, maybe the base you're managing and leading is the right level for enterprise risk management. Whichever level you get to, top leadership support is essential. It's needed to encourage John Fraser's conversations and prioritization. In other words, to get the information flowing and let everybody understand we're not in the business of shooting the messenger. Prioritization, how are we going to allocate scarce resources? Not just money, but scarce management time. Where are the priorities supposed to be? To protect the risk function. That's really important because very often you will have powerful barons that are really busy, thank you very much, and may not want to pay attention to managing risks across the agency unless the top leader says this is important for us to do. And of course, to ensure that feedback is heard, to ensure that nobody shoots the messenger, that communications flow, and that there's somebody responsible for checking out and assessing a warning sign before rather than after a serious risk might materialize. Now, the good news is enterprise risk management is not staff intensive. Chief risk officers do not manage risk. They are facilitators. They help to identify the risks. They help to elicit the communications needed to understand the risks the organization faces and to help with the prioritization process. The unit heads, the people that manage actual operations, own their own risks. They're responsible for management, including managing the vulnerabilities that they've got. But top leadership support is essential because people higher in the organization may be able to help in ways that a unit head by themselves simply can't help to deal with major risks. Once again, let's take a look at your department or agency or other federal organization and do some diagnostics. First, has your agency head created a culture that encourages people to report mistakes, problems, and risks? Has your agency head created a meaningful process for this to take place? Or by contrast, have you ever seen a senior manager respond to unwelcome information by shooting the messenger? In other words, is reporting of adverse information an act of courage? Or is it the way your organization does business? We're going to listen to the report. We're going to examine the report. We'll evaluate it independently because not everybody who reports a risk is correct in their report. But thank you very much. We appreciate that you've given us this information. And finally, on the other hand, have you ever seen a senior manager respond to unwelcome information by rewarding or promoting the messenger? In other words, thank you. You really saved us from something serious. And by looking at these four questions and evaluating your organization, you can get a pretty good idea of where enterprise risk management might be and how important it will be for your department or agency to adopt it. Another set of organizational issues needs to be considered. Government relies on third parties to deliver most public services. These include contractors and also specialized kinds of third parties depending on the kind of program. So credit programs will rely on banks or other lenders to provide government guaranteed loans. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services will rely on doctors and hospitals to provide health care because Medicare or Medicaid for that matter, are really insurance programs rather than direct provision of medical services. The Department of Housing and Urban Development relies on lenders and developers. The National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation rely on grantees to carry out projects. From the perspective of enterprise risk management, the problem is that conversations and prioritization may be difficult across these organizational boundaries. It may be quite helpful to give some thought, for example, to ways that you can build into the performance requirements of contractors that the contractor surface bad news promptly and not simply try to bury it and go on to the end in hopes that the vulnerability will go away. This is really important not only incidentally for government, but also for the private sector. The BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico involved contractors who saw problems, but the people on the front lines on that drilling platform were reporting up their own contractor chain of command, and nobody wanted to report to the client that something was going on. So it's really important to try to figure out, once you want to have an enterprise risk management program in your organization, how you can drill down to be sure that information flows from the third parties that may be doing a lot of work to implementing your programs. So once again, let's turn to some diagnostic questions about your department or agency or other federal organization. First, let's consider 3 alternatives. When someone goes to top management and gives constructive feedback about a major risk, is this considered A, valuable for making a good decision, B, nice but not needed, thank you very much, but please go away, or C, an act of personal courage? And by the way, note the phrasing constructive feedback. We're not trying to elicit complaints and whining and plights. What we're trying to do is elicit information that decision makers can use to understand whether or not a risk exists. Second question, and this is for you as a government manager. As a government manager, how did you react the last time a subordinate, or maybe an outsider, maybe a contractor, gave you feedback about a risk to your favorite program that you're responsible for? Third question, again for you and the programs or activities that you manage. Is there a systematic way to elicit feedback about major risk that could affect those programs or activities? It all begins with us. So these questions are designed to get you to be thinking about, gee, what can I do on my level of the organization, even if the larger organization may not be ready for a full enterprise risk management program. Especially now that the Office of Management and Budget and other leaders in government are emphasizing more effective risk management, there's a downside danger, and that is that risk management becomes a fad or a gesture. What's important is to integrate ERM into agency processes. What does that mean? What that means is that ERM has to be part of the strategic planning process. Here's what we want to accomplish next year or over the next 5 years, and here are the major risks that might prevent us from achieving those goals, and here's how we plan to address those major risks and those possibilities. Second, Inclusion in the budget process, very important. We have scarce resources. To what extent do we need to allocate scarce budget resources to keep our agency going? When I think of the Office of Personnel Management, they could have allocated a lot more managerial talent and contractor talent and budget resources to those risks of cybersecurity. Management reviews, so that each time a manager has a great new initiative, which we all love, great new initiatives, we also discuss, what are the major risks that could prevent us from getting there? And finally, in the end, enterprise risk management is a way of doing business. And when it's really embedded, it will become part of the organization's culture and an automatic part of decision making. Thank you very much. This is a great new idea. We're now going to listen to the people who have concerns about the downside, about potential risks. We're going to have a constructive dialogue. And in the end, we're going to make a really good decision that is based on understanding the risk-reward trade-offs that we face. And again, risk management is way too important to just be a gesture. If it's a gesture in your organization, I don't want to say it's time to leave, but at least keep your eyes open. A lot of agencies are undergoing budget uncertainty and budget cuts. Agencies don't know, is there going to be another sequester? What level of spending should I anticipate, etc. And budget uncertainty and budget cuts are really different in their effects. We've been here before in the 1980s, 1990s. Budget uncertainty attacks the quality of the decision-making process itself. And agencies are going to have to work hard to keep their tone as they prepare multiple scenarios, multiple budgets. It's really hard to keep tone under conditions of such profound uncertainty, but it's really important. Budget cuts have a different effect. What happens with budget cuts is that risk management and the emphasis on conversations and prioritizations becomes even more critical than before. It's just the question is slightly adjusted. And the question for a number of agencies may be, as we refocus our agency's mission to operate with a significantly reduced budget, what are the major risks that could prevent our agency from accomplishing its mission and objectives? This is really important. When the IRS recently suffered a massive, unexpected budget cut, Commissioner John Koskinen had to decide, where are we going to put our priorities? And the answer was, because we have a tax system that is based on voluntary compliance, that we're going to put our priorities on maintaining our audit staff, our enforcement staff. And important as our advice, telephone advice, emailed advice systems are, those systems are going to have to be given lower priority, because we don't dare face a tipping point when people stop complying with the tax laws because they think they will never get audited. With budget cuts, you can't pretend that you can police the same waterfront that you could when you had more resources. Strategy means making choices. You can't just pretend you can do more with less. A large number of problems have occurred, the two NASA space shuttle disasters, from pretending we can do more with less while not having the capability to do as much as the agency could do before when it had substantially more resources. So agencies need to rethink their core mission activities and processes if they face the prospect of budget cuts. And once again, as with ERM generally, planning ahead is a lot better than running the risk that you'll be in full-fledged crisis mode if something really goes wrong. On the other hand, some agencies, when they think through their processes and activities, in fact, may be able to do more with less resources. And a couple of examples come to mind. First of all, federal credit agencies used to re-underwrite guaranteed loans. So a bank would go out and make a small business loan or a mortgage loan and then send all the paperwork to a government field office to be reviewed and assessed. Gee, did they make a solid loan or not? And then the loan would either be approved or not. And soon it became apparent that you could delegate underwriting to your lenders. Let the lender be responsible for underwriting that loan. Don't look over their shoulder. And instead, agencies had to set up what at the Small Business Administration was called an Office of Lender Oversight. Because now we've got to police our lenders and be sure they aren't going to sell us a lot of loans that will go bad and cost taxpayers a lot of money. As soon as agencies did this, it turned out they could take a tremendous burden not only off of their own staffs, which meant they could do more with less, but also off of their partners, their private sector partners that were actively involved. But managing risk, once again, was essential to permitting that to happen. Another example that I really like comes from the Small Business Administration, when they realized that a large part of their staff was managing loans that had gone bad and trying to get the borrowers pleased to pay something. There's almost nothing more time-consuming and nothing less rewarding than trying to manage a non-performing loan. And what the SBA decided was they would take their business loans and sell them to private parties who could collect on those loans. They would set standards so the private parties would collect in a government type of way and not hammer the borrower inappropriately. And the SBA sold $5 billion worth of business loans. What this did was it let the SBA use their shrinking staff resources to serve a growing population of small businesses that needed SBA services than were ever possible before. So with thought, in fact, you can address problems of budget cuts. You may be able to negotiate with the Office of Management and Budget, with your appropriations subcommittee, in order to get the time you need and maybe the resources you need to reconfigure your processes so you can go forward. But once again, we're back to the issue of risk management. You've got to think through what are the risks involved in this new activity and how are we going to contain those risks so the program is a success. So let's have one last set of diagnostic questions about your department or agency or other governmental organization. Does your organization face budget cuts? There are a few organizations out there not dependent on appropriations that don't, but a lot of government organizations will. Second, how well does your top management make decisions where and what to cut in response to new constraints? Third, does top leadership think about risks and the need to avoid making cuts that could threaten your organization's ability to achieve its major goals and objectives? And here what we found is that the Chief Financial Officers Council of the federal government has placed enterprise risk management very high on its list of priorities. If you're concerned that your agency needs to improve the application of ERM to the problem of potential budget cuts, maybe turn to your CFO as a potential ally in this effort. Not every CFO will be on board, but especially as the Office of Management and Budget expands the number of circulars that are going to encourage adoption of enterprise risk management, you may well find a friendly ear and somebody who has the capacity to begin building in risk considerations to the question of how to manage serious budget cuts. I hope you don't have to go there, but if budget cuts are in the picture, that may not be a bad place to start. Once again, let me mention a book that contains more information along the lines of what you've learned from parts 1 and 2 of this risk series. And that's the book Managing Risk and Performance, a guide for government decision makers, that I and Doug Webster, past president of the Association for Federal Enterprise Risk Management, have edited. And a number of the authors in the book present really good ideas, examples, experiences that you may be able to build on. So by all means, go to your local library and see if they have a copy on hand, and I hope it does you some good. In addition, as I noted at the end of part 1, feedback is a gift. So please, if you have thoughts how we can improve another edition of this book or a different book that we may want to edit, please send an email with your suggestions. Thanks very much. There are a number of useful writings on enterprise risk management and risk management generally. I mentioned earlier that John Fraser and his colleagues have edited books that are quite useful, and I recommend both of the 2 books you'll see here. There's a multimedia case study, which of everything on this list, I would recommend first if you really want to understand how enterprise risk management works in practice. And that's by Annette Mikas, Enterprise Risk Management at Hydro One, and it's a Harvard B School case study. You can order it, it's a DVD, just stick it in your computer, and you can see enterprise risk management as a process at the different levels of Hydro One. You hear from different officials, you watch the issue of conversations, percolating communications up and down and across the enterprise, and then prioritization. So if I had to point to one place that you really want to get some insight, it would be that multimedia case study. Finally, Doug Webster and I have written a shorter report that encapsulates a number of the lessons from our edited book. And you see the website here where you can simply download a PDF of that report. So I hope that these 2 parts of the introduction have been useful, and look forward to hearing from you. The Association for Federal Enterprise Risk Management is a community of practice. Our mission is to improve the quality of enterprise risk management across the federal government. As a community of practice, our job is to improve the level of everyone's game. Federal officials, consultants to federal officials, academics like me, everyone who cares about ERM in the federal government. We offer thought leadership, education, and collaboration. Our meetings provide an opportunity for networking. People can exchange information on a very quiet, off-the-record basis. Gee, I've got a problem. Do you have any thoughts? How have you solved this kind of problem? And so forth. We have quarterly lunches where we hear from people from GAO, OMB, other agencies, chief risk officers, whomever. We have an annual conference called the Summit, a day and a half of speakers and panels, and again, great networking opportunities. I hope you can check us out. The organization is really a lot of fun, and I must say it is a total pleasure to be their president for this year. I have rarely worked with such a group of dynamic, interesting, and interested people. So this is the end of part 2 and the end of the introduction. We hope that you have found it informative and hope that you turn to the other elements, the other training modules that are offered in this series, and hope that you find them as valuable as well. Take care, and thank you again for joining us.